The distant cry of a coyote pierced the Montana twilight as Marshal Michael Harrington rode toward Redemption Creek, with a half-dead woman draped across his saddle. Blood from her wounds had dried against his duster, and her pale face, streaked with dirt and tears, rested against his shoulder as they traversed the final stretch of rugged terrain leading to the settlement he'd called home for the past 3 years. The year was 1876, and the West was still wild in ways that made even hardened men like Michael wake in the night with their hands reaching for their revolvers. But nothing in his 15 years riding the frontier had prepared him for what he'd found in that ravaged wagon: a young woman, barely clinging to life, surrounded by the bodies of her family after what appeared to be a brutal attack by road agents. As the silhouette of Redemption Creek's modest Main Street came into view, Michael felt the woman stir against him. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. "Stay with me," he murmured, urging his exhausted chestnut stallion to quicken its pace. "Just a little further." Redemption Creek wasn't much a dusty collection of wooden buildings stretched along a single thoroughfare that culminated in a church whose white steeple had seen better days. But it had a doctor, and right now, that was all that mattered. The setting sun cast long shadows as Michael guided his horse past the saloon, where several men lounged on the porch. Their conversation died as they caught sight of the marshal and his mysterious burden. "What you got there, Marshal?" Called Edwin Parker, the town's most notorious gossip and part-time barber, Michael didn't slow. "Fetch Dr. Simmons. Tell him to meet me at my cabin." By the time he reached his modest home at the edge of town, word had already spread. Lights were appearing in windows as curious residents peered out at the commotion. Michael dismounted carefully, cradling the unconscious woman in his arms. She was lighter than she should be, all bone and sinew beneath the tattered remains of what had once been a fine traveling dress. "Doctor." Simmons arrived as Michael was laying her gently on his bed. "Good Lord," the doctor whispered, setting his bag down. "What happened to her? Found her about 15 miles east," Michael explained, stepping back to give the doctor room to work. "Wagon was attacked, 4 dead looks like her family." She was hidden underneath some canvas, must have been there at least a day. Dr. Simmons's weathered face grew grim as he examined her. "She's got a nasty head wound, dehydration, exposure. It's a miracle she's alive at all. Can you help her?" Michael asked, surprised by the urgency in his own voice. The doctor glanced up at him with a questioning look. "I'll do what I can, but she'll need care afterward. The hotel, she'll stay here," Michael said firmly, surprising himself. Dr. Simmons raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. "I'll need hot water, clean cloth, and your strongest whiskey, and privacy." Michael nodded, grateful for something to do. As he stepped outside to fetch water from the well, he found 3 men waiting on his porch: Edwin Parker, Jasper Williams, who owned the general store, and Bill Thornton, a cattle rancher whose spread bordered the town. "Is it true?" Jasper asked, peering past Michael toward the cabin. "You brought some half-dead woman to your home. She needed help," Michael said simply, brushing past them to reach the well. Bill snorted. "Town's got a perfectly good doctor's office, Marshal. Ain't proper bringing a woman to your place." Michael turned, fixing the man with a stare that had made more dangerous men than Bill Thornton back down. "She stays here where I can protect her until I find out who killed her family." "And who's going to protect your reputation?" Edwin asked, always eager to stir the pot. "Bachelor Marshal taking in a strange woman. People will talk. Let them," Michael replied coldly, filling his bucket. "Now get off my porch. Doctor's working." The men retreated, but Michael knew this was just the beginning. By morning, the whole town would be buzzing with speculation and judgment. He didn't care. Something about finding this woman, about the way she'd clutched his coat when he'd pulled her from beneath that canvas, had awakened a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. 3 hours later, Doctor. Simmons emerged from the bedroom, wiping his hands on a cloth. "She's stable," he announced. "The head wound isn't as bad as I feared. Some bruising, cuts, mild exposure. What she's been through mentally might be worse than the physical injuries." Will she wake up? Michael asked. Yes, though it might be a day or so. I've left laudanum for the pain. She'll need broth, rest, and gentle care. The doctor studied Michael's face. Are you sure about this, Marshal? Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house would, I'm sure, Michael said firmly. After the doctor left, Michael settled into a chair beside the bed. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly young, perhaps 25, with auburn hair that the doctor had cleaned and braided to keep it from the wounds. Her face, though pale and bruised, held a quiet strength even in unconsciousness. Who was she? What had happened on that road, and why did he feel so compelled to protect her? Questions without answers accompanied him as exhaustion finally claimed him. His tall frame awkwardly folded in the small wooden chair beside her bed. The following morning, Michael awoke with a stiff neck and the distinct feeling of being watched. His eyes snapped open to find the woman staring at him, her gaze clear despite the bruising around her right temple. "Who are you?" Her voice was raspy but resolute. "Marshal Michael Harrington," he replied, straightening in his chair. "I found you yesterday, brought you to Redemption Creek." "You're safe now." Her eyes, a striking shade of green, searched his face. "The others," Michael shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping. "All of them?" "Yes, madam." When she opened her eyes again, something had hardened in them. "My name is Willow Hughes." "Those people were my brother, his wife, their little boy, and our hired man." Her voice broke. "We were heading to Oregon. Do you remember what happened?" Michael asked gently. Willow's hand moved to touch the bandage at her temple. "Men on horseback, 6, maybe 7, faces covered. My brother James tried to surrender our valuables, but they—" She swallowed hard. "He told me to hide. I crawled under the wagon, then everything went dark." Michael nodded, making mental notes. "Miss Hughes, I intend to find who did this, but first you need to recover." "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "Everything we had was in that wagon." "You'll stay here until you're well," Michael said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." A flash of wariness crossed her face. "In your home, that's not proper." Despite everything, Michael found himself almost smiling. "That's what the town is already saying, but my cabin has 2 rooms and I spend most days in the marshal's office anyway." He stood, his tall frame unfolding. "Are you hungry? Dr. Simmons said you should try some broth." Before she could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. Michael opened it to find Jasper Williams's wife, Martha, standing there with a covered basket, her expression a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. "Marshal," she said stiffly, "the ladies of the church thought your guest might need some proper female attention and supplies." The emphasis on proper wasn't subtle. Michael stepped aside to let her enter, noting several women across the street watching with undisguised interest. Martha bustled past him into the bedroom, where she stopped short at the sight of Willow. "Oh my," she murmured, her demeanor softening slightly as she took in Willow's injuries. "You poor dear." "This is Miss Willow Hughes," Michael introduced. "Miss Hughes, Martha Williams." "Thank you for your kindness," Willow said quietly. Martha set down her basket and began unpacking it: a nightgown, some toiletries, a small pot of what appeared to be soup. "The marshal told us about your situation. Such a terrible thing, we thought you might need some essentials." "That's very thoughtful," Willow replied. Martha glanced around the sparse cabin with its bachelor furnishings. "Though I must say, Miss Hughes, the hotel would be a much more suitable arrangement for a young lady. Or perhaps you could stay with Reverend Carter and his wife." Michael saw a flicker of something panic, perhaps cross Willow's face before she composed herself. "Marshal Harrington has been kind enough to offer me shelter while I recover," Willow said firmly. "I wouldn't want to impose on anyone else." Martha's lips thinned with disapproval. "Well, if you change your mind." After Martha left, promising to return the next day to help Willow bathe, Michael brought a cup of the soup she'd delivered. "Thank you," Willow said as he helped her sit up against the pillows. "Not just for this, for everything." "It's nothing," Michael said, uncomfortable with gratitude. "It's not nothing," she insisted. "You saved my life, and now you're risking your reputation to give me shelter." Michael shrugged. My reputation can handle it. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You're not what I expected a frontier marshal to be like. What did you expect? Someone rougher? Less? She struggled for the word. Civilized, he offered with a raised eyebrow. Kind, she corrected, and something in her direct gaze made him look away. Over the next few days, a steady stream of visitors came to Michael's cabin, some out of genuine concern, others thinly disguising their nosiness as Christian charity. Through it all, Michael watched Willow grow stronger, her quiet dignity impressing him as she fielded intrusive questions and endured the not-so-subtle suggestions that her presence in the marshal's home was inappropriate. Dr. Simmons visited daily, pleased with her physical recovery but concerned about the nightmares that left her gasping awake in the darkness. Michael heard them too, from his makeshift bed on a bedroll in the main room of the cabin. More than once he'd found himself at her door, hesitating, unsure whether to intrude on her private grief. On the fourth night, when her cries seemed particularly heart-wrenching, he finally entered, finding her sitting upright, tears streaming down her face. I see their faces, she whispered when she noticed him. Every time I close my eyes, without thinking, Michael sat on the edge of the bed and took her trembling hand in his. I know, he said simply, and he did know. He'd seen enough death in his years as a lawman, carried enough ghosts of his own. They sat in silence until her breathing steadied. Only then did he realize he was still holding her hand, her slender fingers warm against his calloused palm. He released it awkwardly and stood. Would you? She began hesitantly. Would you mind staying, just until I fall asleep? He should have refused. It was improper, dangerous even, to the last fragments of propriety they were clinging to. But instead he nodded and settled into the chair beside her bed. Tell me something, she said softly. Something good. So Michael began to speak, telling her about the spring wildflowers that carpeted the hills around Redemption Creek, about the way the mountains looked at sunset, about the eagle that had built its nest atop the old pine near the river. He talked until her eyelids grew heavy and her breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did he allow himself to study her face, the bruises now fading to yellows and greens, her auburn hair spread across the pillow. Something stirred in him that he'd thought long dead, a tenderness, a warmth. Trouble, he thought as he quietly left the room. This woman is going to be nothing but trouble. The following morning, Michael rode out to investigate the site of the attack again. With Willow's description of the attackers, he had more to go on now. He spent hours combing the area, finding tracks that confirmed at least 6 riders had been present, and discovering a distinctive horseshoe print with a chip in its edge, something that might help identify one of the horses involved. When he returned to town late that afternoon, he was surprised to find Willow sitting on his front porch, dressed in clothes that must have been donated by one of the town's women. They hung loosely on her still thin frame. Her hair was neatly braided, and some color had returned to her cheeks. Dr. Simmons said fresh air would do me good, she explained as he dismounted. And I was tired of staring at the same 4 walls. Michael nodded, tying his horse to the hitching post. How are you feeling? Better, she said, though I think your reputation is suffering more than my health now. Michael followed her gaze to where Edwin Parker and several other men were watching from outside the saloon, making no effort to hide their interest. Don't worry about them, Michael said, taking a seat beside her on the porch step. They think I'm that we're. She flushed, unable to finish. People always need something to talk about, Michael replied evenly. Next week it'll be something else. Willow studied his profile. Doesn't it bother you what they're saying? Michael considered this. No, he finally said. What bothers me is that someone murdered your family and is still out there. Willow's expression sobered. Did you find anything today? Michael told her about the tracks and the distinctive horseshoe. It's not much, but it's something. I'm going to check every horse in town tomorrow. And if you don't find it here, then I'll check the next town and the next. His voice was steady with determination. Willow looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. You barely know me. Why are you doing all this? It was a fair question, one Michael had asked himself repeatedly over the past days. Because it's my job, he said finally. But they both knew it was more than that. That evening, as they ate a simple supper together, Willow asked about his life before Redemption Creek. Not much to tell, Michael said, uncomfortable with personal questions. Grew up in Kansas, joined the Union Army when I was 18, became a lawman after the war. Family, she pressed gently. Parents died when I was young, no siblings. He hesitated, then added, was engaged once back east. She didn't care for frontier life. Willow nodded, understanding in her eyes. And you, do you care for it? Michael glanced around his simple cabin. It suits me. I was supposed to be a school teacher, Willow said suddenly, in Portland. That's why we were heading west. I had a position waiting. You still could be, Michael suggested, when you're recovered. Something like despair flashed across her face. How? I have no money, no references, nothing but the clothes someone was kind enough to donate. Before Michael could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. He rose, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip, and opened the door to find Bill Thornton and several other men standing in his yard. Evening, Marshal, Bill said, his voice carrying the slight slur of whiskey. Boys and I were wondering when you're planning to do your job instead of playing nursemaid. Michael stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. What are you talking about, Thornton? Talking about the Wilkins boy who got robbed on the North Road yesterday, Bill said. And how you were too busy with your house guest to investigate proper. Deputy Mason handled that, Michael replied evenly. The boy admitted he lost the money gambling. That ain't the point, another man chimed in. Point is, you brought that woman here and now you're neglecting your duties. Michael's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. I suggest you all head home and sleep it off. We can discuss any legitimate concerns when you're sober. Bill stepped closer, emboldened by whiskey and an audience. Town's talking, Marshal. About how you found yourself a pretty little victim to keep warm at night. Michael moved so quickly that Bill didn't have time to react. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man by his shirt front and pushed him back several steps. That's enough, Michael said, his voice dangerously quiet. Miss Hughes lost her entire family. She's under my protection while she recovers and while I investigate their murders. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me sober and in private. The men shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less eager for confrontation. Now go home, Michael ordered. As they retreated, mumbling, Michael turned to find Willow standing in the doorway, her face pale. I should leave, she said softly when they were alone again. I'm causing you nothing but trouble. No, Michael said firmly. You're not going anywhere until you're fully recovered and we find who did this to your family. And then what? She asked, vulnerability clear in her green eyes. It was a question Michael had been avoiding. What would happen to her once the investigation was concluded? Where would she go? The thought of her leaving created an uncomfortable tightness in his chest that he wasn't ready to examine. One step at a time, he said gently. For now, you're safe here. That night, as Michael lay on his bedroll listening to the familiar creaks of his cabin settling, he heard Willow's door open. She appeared in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I can't sleep, she admitted. Would you mind some company? Michael sat up, suddenly acutely aware that he was wearing only his long underwear and an undershirt. He reached for his shirt, pulling it on as he nodded. Willow settled into a chair near the dying embers of the fire. In the soft glow, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes reflecting the faint light, she looked ethereal. Tell me about them, Michael said quietly. Your family? A sad smile touched her lips. James was my older brother. Serious, responsible, he practically raised me after our parents died. Sarah, his wife, was the gentlest soul you'd ever meet, and little Thomas. Her voice caught. He was only 6, so curious about everything, he wanted to be a lawman like you. Michael felt a pang at the thought of the little boy's life cut short. What about you? He asked. Were you always going to be a teacher? Willow's expression lightened slightly. Ever since I can remember, I love books, learning, sharing that with children. She looked around at his sparse cabin. Do you read, Marshal? Michael, he corrected her. And yes, more than most would guess. He nodded toward a small shelf of books beside his bed. Willow rose and moved to examine the titles, running her fingers along the spines. Shakespeare, Dickens, Whitman. She looked at him with new appreciation. You're full of surprises. Most people don't look past the badge and gun, he admitted. Their loss, she said simply, and something in her direct gaze made heat rise to his face. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing easily between them as they discovered shared interests and perspectives. When Willow finally returned to her room, Michael lay awake for a long time, troubled by the growing awareness that his feelings for this woman were becoming dangerously unprofessional. The next day, Michael set about checking every horse in town for the distinctive horseshoe mark. By mid-afternoon, he'd found nothing. Frustrated, he expanded his search to outlying farms and ranches. It was nearly dusk when he found a bay gelding at a small homestead 3 miles outside of town. The horse belonged to a young man named Jake Mercer, who'd recently begun working as a stable hand at Thornton's ranch. Michael approached Jake carefully, not wanting to spook him if he was indeed one of the attackers. The young man seemed nervous but cooperative as Michael questioned him about the horse. Bought him off a fella passing through about 2 weeks ago, Jake explained. Needed a horse for work at the ranch, didn't know nothing about no special horseshoe. This fella have a name? Michael asked. Jake shrugged, called himself Smith, dark hair, scar on his chin, riding with some others, said they were heading to Montana territory. It wasn't much, but it was the first real lead. Michael rode back to town, his mind working through the implications. A group of men, possibly the same ones who'd attacked Willow's family, had been in Redemption Creek recently. Had they moved on, or were they still in the area? When he returned to the cabin, he found Willow sitting at his table with Reverend Carter's wife, Eleanor, both women bent over pieces of fabric and sewing materials. Marshal, Eleanor greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've been helping Miss Hughes with some new clothing. The ladies of the church contributed the fabric. That's kind of you, Michael said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Eleanor began gathering her things. I've also invited Miss Hughes to stay with us at the parsonage, a more suitable arrangement, I'm sure you'll agree. Michael glanced at Willow, who was studiously focusing on folding a length of calico. That's for Miss Hughes to decide, he said carefully. Eleanor pressed her lips together disapprovingly. Reverend Carter will be speaking with you about this situation, Marshal. The town is concerned about the impropriety. After she left, Michael raised an eyebrow at Willow. The parsonage, she means well, Willow said softly. Is that what you want? Michael asked, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. Willow finally met his gaze. No, she said simply. I feel safe here. But perhaps it would be better for you if I accepted. Michael moved to the stove, busying himself with starting dinner to hide the relief her answer brought him. I told you not to worry about what people say. It's not just talk, Willow said. That confrontation last night. I don't want to cause problems for you. Michael turned to face her. You're not causing problems. The men who murdered your family are. He told her about finding the horse and what Jake had told him. So they were here, Willow said, her voice barely above a whisper. In this town. Maybe even while I've been here. Possibly, Michael admitted. But if Jake's telling the truth, they've moved on toward Montana. And if he's not, Michael's expression hardened, then I'll find them, I promise you that. That evening they sat together on his porch, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. The air was cool but pleasant, scented with pine and the distant smell of someone's cooking fire. I've been thinking, Michael said after a comfortable silence. Redemption Creek could use a school. Willow looked at him in surprise. A school? Town's growing, lot of children with no formal education. Parents have been talking about it for a while, but no one's taken action. Willow's eyes widened as she understood his implication. Are you suggesting? "You're a trained teacher," Michael said, "and you need a position." Hope flickered across her face before doubt replaced it. "The town would never accept me, not after all this." "They might once they get to know you," Michael said. "Once they see past the gossip." Before Willow could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared in the fading light, pulling up in front of Michael's cabin. Michael stood, recognizing the lead rider as Tom Foster, a rancher whose property lay about 10 miles east. "Marshal," Foster called, dismounting. "Got trouble. Rustlers hit my south pasture last night, took nearly 30 head." Michael frowned. "Anyone hurt?" "My boy Peter took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc's with him now. But I tracked the herd about 5 miles before losing the trail." "Thought you should know they were heading this way." Michael nodded grimly. "How many men?" "6, maybe 7, Foster replied. "Well armed?" Willow gasped softly beside him, and Michael felt her hand touch his arm. "Did you get a look at any of them?" he asked Foster. "Too dark." "But one of 'em had a voice you wouldn't forget, deep, with some kind of accent, foreign-like." Michael exchanged a glance with Willow. "I'll ride out at first light," he told Foster. "Get a deputy to come with me." After the ranchers left, Willow turned to Michael, her face pale in the darkness. "It's them, isn't it?" "The same men." "Could be," Michael acknowledged. "The numbers match." Willow wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking vulnerable. "What if they come here? What if they realize I survived?" Michael's protective instinct flared. "They won't get near you," he promised, the intensity in his voice surprising them both. Later that night, after Willow had gone to bed, Michael cleaned his rifle and revolver, checked his ammunition, and made preparations for the morning's ride. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the possibility that the men who had murdered Willow's family were now in the vicinity of Redemption Creek. If they discovered she was alive and could identify them, they might come for her. The thought made his blood run cold. Dawn was just breaking when Michael finished writing a note explaining the situation to his deputy, Mason. He left it on his desk at the marshal's office, then returned to his cabin to find Willow already awake, a cup of coffee waiting for him. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly as he strapped on his gun belt. "Yes, I do," he replied. "It's my job." "Be careful," Willow said, her eyes reflecting concern that went beyond mere gratitude. On impulse, Michael reached out and touched her cheek gently. "I will." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings, before Michael broke it by turning to gather his gear. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me or Deputy Mason." Michael and Deputy Mason, a former cavalry scout in his 40s, picked up the rustlers' trail about a mile from Foster's ranch. The signs were clear, a large herd driven hard, accompanied by several riders. "They're not hiding their tracks," Mason observed as they followed the trail through a narrow valley. "Either they're not worried about being followed, or it's a trap," Michael finished grimly. They proceeded cautiously, alert for any sign of ambush. By mid-morning, they tracked the rustlers to a box canyon with steep walls and a narrow entrance, a perfect place to corral stolen cattle. "I don't like this," Mason muttered as they dismounted and secured their horses in a grove of trees a safe distance away. "Too easy to get trapped in there." Michael nodded in agreement. "We'll approach on foot, get a look at what we're dealing with before making any moves." They made their way slowly toward the canyon entrance, using the rocky terrain for cover. As they neared the mouth of the canyon, voices drifted toward them, men arguing, the lowing of cattle. Michael and Mason crept closer, finding a position behind a large boulder that offered a view into the canyon. Inside, about 30 head of cattle were gathered at the far end. 6 men moved among them, 2 on horseback, 4 on foot. "Recognize any of them?" Mason whispered. Michael studied each man carefully. One stood apart from the others, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and what appeared to be a scar on his chin. Jake's description of Smith came to mind. "Maybe," Michael replied softly, "the one by the fire." As they watched, The men began preparing to move the herd again. It was clear they were planning to drive the cattle further into the mountains where they could be hidden until they could be sold or rebranded. "What's your plan, Marshal?" Mason asked. Michael considered their options. 2 lawmen against 6 well-armed rustlers weren't good odds, but if these were the same men who had murdered Willow's family, he couldn't let them escape. "We wait until they start moving the herd," he decided. "Hit them when they're stretched out along the trail. Take the rear men first, work our way forward." Mason nodded, checking his Winchester. "And if they don't cooperate? Then we make sure at least one of them lives to stand trial," Michael said grimly. They retreated to their horses and circled around to a position further along the trail the rustlers would likely take. There, they set up an ambush point where the path narrowed between 2 rocky outcroppings. It was nearly noon when the rustlers emerged from the canyon, driving the stolen cattle ahead of them. Michael and Mason waited, tense and ready, as the herd passed their position, followed by the first 2 riders. When the remaining 4 men approached, Michael stepped out, rifle raised. "U.S. Marshal, throw down your weapons." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The rustlers reacted instantly, diving for cover and drawing their guns. Gunfire erupted, the sound reverberating off the canyon walls. Michael felt the burn of a bullet grazing his arm but held his position, returning fire methodically. Beside him, Mason dropped one of the rustlers with a clean shot. Another fell to Michael's rifle. The remaining 4 scattered, using the rocks and brush for cover as they fired back. A bullet struck the rock near Michael's head, sending fragments flying. He ducked, then rose to take aim at a rustler making a break for his horse. His shot found its mark and the man tumbled to the ground. "Marshal," Mason's warning came too late. A searing pain tore through Michael's side as a bullet found its mark. He staggered but remained standing, pivoting to face his attacker, the scarred man he'd noticed earlier. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Michael knew this was one of the men responsible for the attack on Willow's family. There was a coldness in those eyes, a casual cruelty that spoke of a man who killed without remorse. Michael raised his revolver despite the burning pain in his side. The scarred man fired first, his bullet whistling past Michael's ear. Michael's return shot was more accurate, striking the man in the chest. The scarred man looked almost surprised as he fell to his knees, then forward onto the rocky ground. The remaining rustlers, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. One threw down his weapon in surrender. The other made a desperate attempt to escape on horseback but was cut down by Mason's rifle. When the gunsmoke cleared, 4 rustlers lay dead, 1 was severely wounded, and 1 had surrendered. Mason, aside from a minor wound to his shoulder, was largely unharmed. Michael, however, was losing blood rapidly from the wound in his side. "Need to get you to the doctor," Mason said, helping Michael to his horse. "Check them first," Michael insisted, grimacing with pain. "Need to know if they're the ones." Mason quickly searched the bodies, finding wanted posters on 2 of them and, more significantly, items that clearly hadn't belonged to simple cowboys: a lady's gold locket, a fine pocket watch, and other personal effects that could have been taken from Willow's family. "Looks like you found your killers, Marshal," Mason said grimly. The ride back to town was a blur of pain for Michael. By the time they reached Redemption Creek, he was barely conscious, slumped over his saddle. Mason rode ahead, shouting for the doctor. Willow heard the commotion from Michael's cabin and ran outside to see what was happening. When she saw Michael being lifted from his horse, blood soaking his shirt, she let out a cry that silenced the gathering crowd. She pushed through the onlookers, reaching him just as Dr. Simmons directed several men to carry Michael to the doctor's office. "Michael," she called, forgetting propriety in her fear. She grasped his hand and his eyes flickered open briefly. "Found them," he murmured before losing consciousness again. The next few hours were the longest of Willow's life. She paced outside the doctor's office, deaf to the whispers and stares of the townspeople gathered nearby. When Dr. Simmons finally emerged, his shirt sleeves rolled up and blood on his apron, she rushed to him. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor told her, his voice low. "The bullet went clean through, which is fortunate, but he's weak and there's risk of infection." "Will he live?" Willow asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Simmons hesitated. "If infection doesn't set in, yes, he's strong. But he'll need careful nursing." "I'll do it," Willow said immediately. "Tell me what to do." The doctor studied her determined face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but you'll need help. This isn't a job for a woman alone." To Willow's surprise, several townspeople stepped forward, offering assistance. Eleanor Carter, Martha Williams, even Bill Thornton's wife announced they would take shifts helping with Michael's care. "Seems the marshal has more friends than he realized," Dr. Simmons observed with a small smile. When Michael was stable enough to be moved, they brought him back to his own cabin, setting up a proper sick in his room. Willow took the first watch, sitting beside him as he drifted in and out of consciousness. During one of his lucid moments, he told her about the confrontation with the rustlers. "They had your brother's watch," he said weakly. "And a locket gold with a pattern of roses." Tears filled Willow's eyes. "Sarah's locket. James gave it to her on their wedding day." Michael nodded, wincing at the movement. "They won't hurt anyone else now." Willow gently wiped his brow with a cool cloth. "You could have been killed. Worth the risk," he mumbled before drifting back to sleep. As days passed, Michael slowly improved. The town, which had been so quick to judge Willow's presence in the marshal's home, now seemed to accept her as his caretaker. Perhaps it was the circumstances, or perhaps it was the way she had publicly shown her concern for him. Whatever the reason, the whispers gradually subsided. Deputy Mason handled the marshal's duties, occasionally bringing reports to Michael's bedside. The surviving rustlers had confessed to the attack on Willow's family's wagon, confirming what Michael had suspected. They would stand trial in the territorial court when the circuit judge arrived. One evening, about 2 weeks after the shootout, Michael was sitting up in bed, color returning to his face, as Willow read to him from one of his books of poetry. "You have a good reading voice," he observed when she paused to pour him some water. "You'd make an excellent teacher." Willow smiled, the first truly carefree smile he'd seen from her. "Actually, I've been meaning to tell you. While you were recovering, Reverend Carter approached me about starting a school." Michael raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Did he now?" "It seems your suggestion wasn't so far-fetched after all," Willow continued. "The town council met and decided Redemption Creek needs a proper school. They've offered me the position, provided I can pass an examination of my qualifications when the circuit judge comes through." "That's wonderful news," Michael said, genuinely pleased for her. "When would this start?" "Not until you're fully recovered," Willow assured him. "I told them I wouldn't leave you until then." The implication hung in the air between them that eventually she would leave his cabin, his daily life. It was the proper thing, the expected thing. Yet Michael found the thought unexpectedly painful. "And where will you stay?" he asked carefully. "Eleanor Carter has offered me a room at the parsonage until more permanent arrangements can be made," Willow replied. "They're talking about building a small cottage for the teacher eventually." Michael nodded slowly. "That sounds suitable." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken feelings and uncertain futures. "Michael," Willow finally said, setting the book aside, "what happens now?" "You become Redemption Creek schoolteacher," he replied, attempting lightness. "The children learn their letters, life goes on." "That's not what I meant," she said softly. Michael met her gaze, the pretense falling away. "I know." In the weeks since he'd found her, half dead beneath that canvas, something had grown between them, something neither had anticipated or sought. A connection forged through shared trauma and quiet evenings, through danger and recovery. "I'm not sure what happens next," Michael admitted. "I only know I'm not ready for you to leave." Willow's eyes widened slightly at his honesty. "I'm not ready to leave either," she whispered. Before either could say more, a knock at the door interrupted them. Willow rose to answer it, finding Martha Williams standing there with a covered dish. "Brought some supper," Martha announced, bustling in. "How's our patient today?" As Martha chatted, serving them both generous portions of her rabbit stew, Michael caught Willow's eye across the room. A silent understanding passed between them. Their conversation wasn't over, merely postponed. By the following week, Michael was strong enough to move around the cabin and even venture outside to sit on the porch. The town's attitude toward him and Willow had undergone a remarkable transformation. Those who had once gossiped now brought food and offered assistance. The story of how Michael had risked his life to bring Willow's family's killers to justice had spread, casting their unusual living arrangement in a more heroic light. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Bill Thornton rode up with several other men. Michael tensed, remembering their last confrontation, but the rancher's manner was different this time, almost contrite. "Marshal," Bill greeted, removing his hat. "Good to see you up and about." Michael nodded cautiously. "What can I do for you, Bill?" "Actually, we came to do something for you," Bill replied. "Boys and I have been talking. That school the town's planning, it needs a proper building. We're offering to help build it." Michael glanced at Willow, whose surprise matched his own. "That's generous of you." Bill shuffled his feet uncomfortably. "Well, some of us weren't too welcoming when Miss Hughes first arrived, figured this might make amends." "That's very kind," Willow said warmly. "The children will benefit greatly." After the men left, promising to return with plans and materials, Willow turned to Michael with wonder in her eyes. "I don't understand," she said. "What changed?" Michael considered this. "People can surprise you. Sometimes it just takes something to shake them out of their habits." "Like a marshal getting shot while bringing killers to justice," Willow suggested with a raised eyebrow. "Like seeing someone for who they really are, not what gossip says they are," Michael corrected gently. That evening, as they finished their supper, Willow announced she would be moving to the parsonage the following day. "Dr. Simmons says you're well enough now that you don't need constant care," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "And with the town's attitude changed, there's no reason to continue scandalizing Reverend Carter." Michael felt a hollowness open inside him at her words, though he knew they were sensible. "Of course," he managed. "It's the right thing to do." Willow began clearing the dishes, her movements brisk and efficient. "I've taken advantage of your hospitality for far too long." "It wasn't like that," Michael said, rising to help her despite the twinge in his side. "No," Willow agreed softly. "It wasn't." They worked in silence for a moment. The familiar domestic routine suddenly weighted with significance, perhaps the last time they would share such simple intimacy. "I should thank you," Willow said finally, "for everything, for saving my life, for finding justice for my family, for giving me a chance at a new beginning here." "You don't need to thank me," Michael replied. "Yes, I do," she insisted. "You've done so much, risked so much, and I've given nothing in return." "That's not true," Michael said, his voice low and intense. He set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her fully. "You've given me." He searched for words, company, purpose, a reason to come home beyond an empty cabin. Color rose in Willow's cheeks. "Michael." "I'm not good with words," he continued, the dam of his reticence finally breaking. "Not like in those books. But I know that the thought of you leaving tomorrow makes me feel like I'm being shot all over again." Willow's eyes widened at his raw confession. "It doesn't have to be goodbye," she whispered. "I'll still be in town just down the street." "It won't be the same," Michael said, shaking his head, "and I don't want to go back to how things were before." The tension between them stretched taut as a bowstring. Michael stepped closer, hesitant despite his words. Willow didn't back away. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm saying I care for you," Michael replied. "More than I should, more than is proper given how we met, given everything." Willow's breath caught. "I care for you too." Michael reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and touched her cheek. When she leaned into his touch, something broke loose inside him, hope, long dormant, suddenly blooming. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as my patient, not as someone I'm protecting." "Stay because you want to. People will talk," Willow said, but there was no conviction in her words. "Let them," Michael replied, echoing what he'd said that first night. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. "Or we could give them something else to talk about," he said, gathering his courage. "We could get married." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and irretrievable. For one terrible moment, Michael thought he'd misread everything, moved too quickly. Then Willow smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I think we should." Michael pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his healing wound, and kissed her a tender, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as she responded with unexpected fervor. When they finally parted, breathless, Michael rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure? It hasn't been long. What happened to your family, everything you've been through?" "I'm sure," Willow said firmly. "Life is too uncertain, too precious to waste. My family's deaths taught me that. And what's grown between us these past weeks, it's real, Michael. More real than anything I've known." 2 weeks later, on a perfect autumn day, Michael Harrington and Willow Hughes were married in Redemption Creek's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the same people who had once whispered and judged now celebrating with genuine warmth. Reverend Carter performed the ceremony, his wife beaming in the front row, despite having lost her prospective boarder. Martha Williams had baked a 3-tiered cake, and Bill Thornton provided a barrel of his best whiskey for the celebration that followed. As evening fell, the newlyweds found themselves beside a bonfire in the town square, surrounded by well-wishers. The night air was crisp, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the firelight cast a warm glow on the gathering. Willow, wearing a simple but elegant dress that the town's women had helped create, laughed at something Deputy Mason said. The sound of her laughter carried across the square, bright and free, drawing attention and smiles. Edwin Parker, standing nearby with several other men who had once confronted Michael about taking Willow in, shook his head with a rueful smile. "Never thought I'd say this, Marshal," he admitted, "but you were right to bring her here. Town's better for having her." Michael watched his bride, radiant in the firelight, and felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. "I'm the one who's better for having her," he replied quietly. Later, as the celebration continued, Michael found himself standing slightly apart, observing the scene with satisfaction. Dr. Simmons approached, handing him a cup of whiskey. "Remarkable turn of events," the doctor commented, nodding toward Willow, who was now showing several children how to roast apples in the fire's embers. "From nearly dead in your bed to the town's beloved new schoolteacher and Marshal's wife in less than 2 months." Michael smiled. "Life has a way of surprising you. Indeed it does," Dr. Simmons agreed. "Though I must confess, when I first treated her in your cabin, I never imagined this outcome." "Neither did I," Michael admitted. "And yet," the doctor mused, "watching you two now, it seems inevitable." As if finding her that day was more than chance. Michael considered this, watching as Willow's laugh rang out again, the firelight dancing in her auburn hair. Perhaps the doctor was right. Perhaps some things were meant to be, even when they began in tragedy and misunderstanding. As if sensing his gaze, Willow looked up and met his eyes across the fire. Her smile, meant only for him, held promises of a future neither had dared imagine when their paths first crossed. Michael raised his cup in a silent toast to them, to second chances and unexpected joy. And as he did, he realized that the gossips of Redemption Creek had finally fallen silent. Their mockery transformed to admiration as they watched Willow laugh beside his fire. 5 years later, on another autumn evening, Michael sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Willow helped their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, gather the last of the season's wildflowers in the front yard. Redemption Creek had grown considerably in those years. The school Willow had started now boasted 3 rooms and nearly 40 students. Michael had trained 2 additional deputies, to help manage the increased law enforcement needs of the growing community. Their lives had settled into a rhythm that balanced Willow's teaching with Michael's duties as marshal. They'd weathered difficult times, a harsh winter, a bout of scarlet fever that had swept through the town, the occasional outlaw passing through. But through it all, their bond had only strengthened. "Papa," Sarah called, running toward him with her small hands full of purple asters. "For you." Michael scooped up his daughter, accepting the slightly crushed flowers with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, little one, they're beautiful." Willow followed, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. She was due in less than a month, and Michael found himself marveling anew at how his life had transformed. "Supper's almost ready," she said, smiling at the picture they made the once solitary Marshal with a small child in his arms. As they went inside together, Michael caught sight of a familiar figure riding toward their home, Bill Thornton, now a close friend and the godfather to their daughter. "Bill's coming," he told Willow. "Probably wants to discuss the new town council proposal." Willow nodded, setting plates on the table. "Invite him for supper. There's plenty." Later, as they sat around the table together, Bill regaled them with stories of his latest cattle drive, making Sarah giggle with his exaggerated tales. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years since you two got married," Bill remarked, accepting another helping of Willow's rabbit stew. "Remember how folks used to talk when you first brought her here?" Michael reached across the table to take Willow's hand. "I remember. And now look at you, the most respected family in Redemption Creek," Bill continued. "Just goes to show how wrong people can be." After Bill left and Sarah was tucked into bed, Michael and Willow sat together on their porch, watching as stars appeared one by one in the night sky. "Are you happy?" Michael asked, his arm around her shoulders. Willow leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "Completely, are you?" Michael thought about the lonely man he'd been before finding her on that terrible day, a man who'd resigned himself to solitude, who'd stopped expecting joy. "More than I ever thought possible," he answered truthfully. As if on cue, a familiar sound floated through the evening air, laughter from the saloon, the church bell signaling 8 o'clock, a distant coyote calling to its mate. The sounds of Redemption Creek, the town that had once mocked and now embraced them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" Willow asked softly. Michael tightened his arm around her. "I try not to think about it." "I do," she admitted. "Not to dwell on what might have been, but to remember how precious this is, what we've built together. How close we came to never having it at all." Michael turned to look at her, this woman who had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. In the soft evening light, with her hand resting protectively over their unborn child, she was more beautiful to him than on the day they'd married. "I love you, Willow Harrington," he said simply. She smiled, the same radiant smile that had first captured his heart years ago beside another fire. "And I love you, Michael Harrington. Always will." As darkness settled fully around their home, they remained on the porch, talking softly about their plans for the future, the baby's arrival, Sarah's schooling, the town's continued growth. Simple dreams shared between two people who had found in each other something neither had expected. A second chance, a new beginning, a love that had blossomed against all odds in the harsh beauty of the frontier. And in Redemption Creek, as lamps were lit in windows and families gathered for evening meals, no one remembered anymore that they had once mocked the Marshal for taking in a half-dead stranger. All they knew was that the teacher and the lawman belonged together, as naturally as the mountains belonged to the sky. That night, as they had every night since their wedding, Michael and Willow fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together, a chance encounter on a blood-soaked trail that had somehow led to this. A home filled with love, a life shared, and the promise of many more years together in the town that had finally accepted them both.